We're making a turn in the study of John. We're moving from chapter 11 into chapter 12, and as we figuratively turn that page to John 12, we are right on the edge of the last week of Jesus' life, and it's amazing because John gives so much of his gospel where the focus is those last 6 or 7 days and what takes place. In this part of our study of John, we're going to sit with the disciples in the upper room. And again, there are 4 or 5 chapters devoted just to that meeting with his disciples. And we're going to be able to sit in on that and be able to hear Jesus as he talks with his disciples. We're going to see him betrayed. We're going to see him arrested, put on trial, condemned. And then even though most of the disciples were absent, we are going to stand on Golgotha as Jesus dies. There is going to be that exuberant surprise of Jesus coming back to life. And finally, there's going to be that moment when we realize that Jesus has returned to heaven and he turns the work of the ministry over to his disciples, which through the years has now been handed down to us, for us to fulfill his mission and his purpose. Before we move into the depth of all John provides about the last week of Jesus' life, we are going to talk about motivation today. Because John 12, it is filled with motivation, as we will see in more depth next week when Jesus makes his entrance into Jerusalem. He was motivated. He came with a purpose. Motivation matters. Wouldn't you like to know why you do what you do? Or why your spouse does what he or she does? Or how about your kids? Or kids, how about your parents? Why do they do what they do? We're going to talk about spiritual motivations in our lives by looking at one of the greatest studies in motivation that exists. Think about the different motivations here as we see first Martha and Mary and Lazarus. And then it's Judas, the disciples, the chief priest, the crowds of people. We learn motivation is important. It is essential, and determining what it is that motivates us makes big differences in the way we live. I thought about this when a crime is committed. One of the first steps taken by investigators is trying to determine the motive. The motive may lead to being able to identify the criminal. We see a tender scene here in this chapter where a woman named Mary is motivated to honor Jesus with a special act of worship. It's already been mentioned by John in chapter 11 when Mary was identified there chronologically before she even did what she's going to do here in this chapter. She was identified as the one who anointed Jesus' feet. She came to be identified by that act, and it differentiated her from all of the other people named Mary in the New Testament. And so as we investigate motivations, we're looking into what I believe matters, I think, most to God about the way we live life. A question we all need to answer: what do you think matters most to God? Our motives or our actions? David was very clear on this subject when he sinned and then sought repentance. He observed, praying to God, "You do not desire a sacrifice, or I would offer one. You do not want a burnt offering. The sacrifice you desire is a broken spirit. You will not reject a broken and repentant heart, O God." When evaluating our actions, God looks first at our hearts. He wants to discern the attitude that motivates us. And so John is setting that stage for the start of this last week of Jesus' life when he writes 6 days before the Passover, the biggest event in Jewish life. Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus lived. Now, just in case you don't know who Lazarus is, Jesus adds this little note. This is the Lazarus whom Jesus had raised from the dead. You need to know that, and he identifies that. Here's the thing, 6 days before Passover. What would you do if you knew you had 1 week left to live? Jesus chooses to spend time with the people who were most important to him. So let me change the question I just asked. What would Jesus want you to do if you had only 1 week left to live and you knew that? Now, we might expect Jesus to say to get out there and tell everyone you can about Jesus. Make sure you do that. From this, I think instead he might say, take time with your family. Take time to assure them that those who love Jesus as Savior and Lord, that he has control over what is taking place. Because Jesus makes sure to spend time with those who matter most to him, those who are closest to him, those who would feel the impact of his death the most, so that they would know that Jesus is with them. The chronology of all this, as we tie it together, in John 11, Jesus comes to raise Lazarus from the dead. After that, he heads back out into the desert. He goes back into the desert to spend time with his disciples, and then it's time. It's time. His first stop is back in Bethany to spend time with his good friends. He was getting ready, and he was helping them to be ready as well. The struggles that he would endure during this last week of his life, he needed them to be prepared, and there had to be an energized atmosphere as a dinner is held to honor Jesus. John 12:2, here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. That must have been some dinner. Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. The spiritual motivation for Jesus' friends was worship. Martha, Lazarus, and Mary are motivated to worship Jesus. Now, Martha worships by serving Jesus. Serving is what Martha naturally does. It was true in an earlier visit where Martha was irritated with her sister because Martha was working while Mary sat at Jesus' feet and listened to him. But Martha, she serves Jesus. Now, Jesus never condemns Martha for serving. He does call her to answer for judging Mary because Mary does something different from what Martha's doing. We need to take that as a lesson that we should never expect others to have the same motivations and priorities as we do. Martha was motivated to serve. I know as I was thinking about all of this morning with this verse, you know how there are different love languages? Martha's love language was expressed through serving others. And that's what she does as she gives honor to Jesus. Now, Lazarus is worshiped by fellowshipping with Jesus. Lazarus was included with those who reclined at the table with Jesus for this meal. And I wonder about the conversation there around that table. And then I had this thought. Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead. I think that had to be a topic of conversation around the table. Well, Lazarus, what was it like being dead? Well, I really don't remember anything. I was dead. But Jesus knows this is the week he's going to die. And he's already told them he's going to be in the tomb. He's given an allusion, 3 days. 3 days, he's going to rise. Now, if you're going to go through something, isn't it nice to talk with someone who has already gone through that same experience? Lazarus knew what it was like to die. And he also knows what it's like to be restored to life and being able to live with others and to share that testimony. And then there's Mary. Mary worshiped through extravagant giving. John highlights this. Mary giving extravagantly to Jesus. And before looking at her act of worship, which one would you say is really worshiping Jesus? Martha serves, Lazarus fellowships, Mary gives. Each act is a unique demonstration of worship, expressing the motives of the worshiper's heart in the purest way possible. Each act of worship, the best that that person could offer. And so when you worship, let your acts of worship be the genuine expression of your heart to Jesus. But John does put the spotlight on Mary, and what she does here, he wants us to don't miss this. When Matthew tells the same story, he adds this note. I tell you the truth, that's that amen, amen, verily, verily, I tell you the truth. Wherever the good news is preached throughout the world, this woman's deed will be remembered and discussed, and that's what we're doing right now, just as Matthew predicted. What Mary does is unique to Mary. She takes a pint of pure nard. It's an aromatic herb grown in the pasture lands of the Himalayas between Tibet and India. So it's a rare herb, and it's made into a perfume, and it's been shipped from a considerable distance. The amount of the perfume, it's estimated it was worth about 300 days' wages, 300 days of earnings. Now, if you want to be exactly like Mary, I'm sure there's a way to be able to arrange for a direct deposit of your next year's salary directly into the church account. And you can be exactly like Mary, giving with that type of extravagance. Her gift, it was an extravagant gift. It was a sacrificial gift. It's a misunderstood gift. Why would someone do that? But most of all, it was a genuine gift to extravagantly express how deeply she loves Jesus. She has some things that she can teach us about worship. The fact is, our values are revealed through our actions. Mary's values are shown in the way she acts. She demonstrates how she values her Lord more than anything else in the world. This is what motivates her. Let's look at what had to happen for Mary to be able to give this sacrificial worship to Jesus. It involved costly preparation on her part. She had kept the ointment for something when she figures out that it's for this time. We aren't told how she came to have this. It could have been a gift to her. Not likely. It could have been a treasure that she has purchased for herself. It may have been inherited. There is a sacrifice involved in giving this gift. It's had a special place where she has kept it. Someone has written that worship is a heart transformed that expresses love regardless of the cost. Mary has this treasure, and she pays the price to keep that treasure for just the right day. She had to be ready in advance. It wasn't something where she could just go, I need to do something for Jesus today. She was prepared to do the right thing when the moment came. It was an intentional act when she brought it to the table. What was she thinking as she walked into this room and approached the table? In that day, it would have been all men at the table. Her act in honoring Jesus requires an intentional decision on her part. I am going to go into that room where I'm not really welcome necessarily, but she knows that Jesus will welcome her. She must have been confident Jesus isn't going to turn her away. And then it involved a point of commitment. She breaks the jar. We learn this from Matthew and Mark. Now think about it. She has this expensive jar of perfume. She wants to use it on Jesus. I might expect her to dip her finger in and then maybe put some on Jesus' hair or on his cheek, but to just carefully get a small amount and place it on him. She breaks the jar. It's an all or nothing moment. She wants Jesus to know that he motivates her heart. A year's salary. People are surprised, shocked. Great sacrifices are the result of a great commitment to God. There is a moment, even when we have decided to do something, when we come to the edge of the cliff and we have to make that leap. And so for Mary, it was an act of love. She poured the perfume on him. When Mary comes to that moment, she doesn't say, I'll pour out a little and then see how the people respond and then decide what I'll do next. I'll see if Jesus is at all pleased by this. Maybe he'll even smile. No, she breaks the jar. And in that moment, she says, I am giving everything I have. It was either going to be seen as a waste of money or an extravagant expression of love. And perspective is important here. It is the result of our values. It all depends on what you think about Jesus. There were some people we're going to see who calculated the cost of what Mary had done, and for them it added up to a shameful waste, when it truly was a sincere act of love. Finally, it was done humbly. She dried his feet with her hair. When you combine what Matthew and Mark record with John's account, here's the picture we see. The perfume poured on Jesus' head. It drips all the way down to his feet. And with what is left in the jar, she pours what's left on his feet. And Mary then takes down her hair where it has been properly tied in place. Because as soon as a Jewish woman came of age, she would tie her hair up and it would never again be seen in public with her hair done because it was considered humiliating to do so. She takes her hair down and she dries Jesus' feet with her hair. Selfless love for Jesus. She forgets about everyone else at that table. She forgets about what everyone might think. And she does what is best to be honored, to be able to honor Jesus. Now, perfuming the head and the body, it was reserved for royalty. It was the greatest honor a common person could bestow on royalty. She's also saying to Jesus, you are Savior as well as King, as she prepares his body for death, as Jesus says. And so when Mary pours out the perfume, we're told that the fragrance filled the house. Everyone noticed the powerful perfume. I think it would have stayed on Jesus' clothes. It would have been noticeable for days. For the next week, everywhere Jesus went, people would smell perfume. And then I wonder if the Roman soldiers who casted lots for Jesus' robe, when they picked the robe up, where they may have said, this smells really good. It has the scent of royalty on it. The most noticeable element of humility is that Mary focused on Jesus only and what she was doing for him. More specifically, she's looking at Jesus' feet. I thought, it might have been she could have poured it out and then had that moment where, it's like Justin Jefferson where she did the gritty there for the disciples. I can't do the gritty. I'm not even going to try. She focused on his feet, not hers. In that day, feet were dirty. They were smelly. Jesus' feet needed to be dried, and that meant getting her hair dirty. That's what she did. And so we learn what it means to worship Jesus. Martha, Lazarus, Mary, they each have their own way. And Mary is remembered for her extravagant act of worship and what she did 2,000 years ago. It's still impacting people today. Now the picture kind of changes as we go to a real scoundrel. The spiritual motivation of Judas was selfishness. Another motion. John teaches us that the result of how our love for Christ is expressed, it can be misunderstood. If you love Jesus, you can be misunderstood. People are not going to understand why you love Jesus and why you're willing to make the sacrifices that you do for him. One of Jesus' disciples is the prime example. The motivation of his heart in John 12, one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected to what Mary did. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He sounds so noble, doesn't he? We could have given this to those who are poor. And then you read the next verse. He didn't say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. The other disciples must have known a little bit of what was going on. And so being able to sell that bottle of perfume, it would make a nice addition to the money bag. Ample opportunity to help himself. Now, he uses the poor to benefit himself. He is the picture of selfish greed, which is a powerful motivator. Have any of you ever been motivated by selfishness or greed? There's an important lesson in these verses. Did you know that people will lie about their motivation? Judas lies, and he sounds so sincere, so smooth as he points to how Mary's gift could have helped. And he never means a word of it. I'll date myself with this, but when I was thinking about this, I realized Judas is actually Eddie Haskell. Eddie Haskell from the old TV show Leave It to Beaver, he was always so polite and everything sounded so good as he talked with Beaver's parents, Ward and June. But they knew all along that he was actually a jerk disguising his true motivations. Judas is lower than a jerk. We look at Mary's extravagant gift and we marvel at the depth of her worship. Judas looks at it and he criticizes her. What a waste. And you need to know that when you give yourself to Jesus, when you truly give yourself to Jesus, you open yourself to being criticized because of that motivation. Never feel guilty about expressing your heart and giving your best to Jesus. Judas is an example of people who worked for God without worshiping God. Every church has them. They are some of the most dangerous people. They make true worshipers feel guilty, and they draw people into false teachings, especially the one that says you have to work harder if you're going to earn love from God. That's where Judas was. His next act, then Judas Iscariot, Matthew tells us, one of the 12 disciples went to the leading priest and asked, how much? Boy, I just missed out on that payday from all that perfume. How much will you pay me to betray Jesus to you? And they gave him 30 pieces of silver. He missed out, but he wasn't going to miss out completely. His selfishness overwhelms him, and he goes out and he betrays Jesus. Selfishness motivated him, and he got those 30 pieces of silver. Talk about values. Talk about motivation. One person, Mary, gives a year's wages to worship Jesus, and another person, Judas, betrays the Son of God for 30 silver coins. The power of motivation on display. Because here's what Jesus says then about Mary. Leave her alone. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. Now, Jesus isn't saying here you shouldn't care about the poor. He's trying to help Judas understand this is a one-time opportunity to express love to Jesus at a time when he really needs it. It's too easy to find reasons for not showing great love. Mary chooses to show Jesus that she loves him. There will be other times to take care of the poor, but not to take care of Jesus. That motivation of selfishness, it can drive us so off course. Another motivation is the one shown by the crowd. It's curiosity. They're following Jesus. The crowd is even larger this time because they are motivated by curiosity. Why are they so motivated now? Well, John tells us. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he'd raised from the dead. They would have had all kinds of questions. Are the rumors actually true that Lazarus is alive? Is it really Lazarus? I have to see for myself. What does a guy look like who's been raised from the dead? That encourages me. People's natural curiosity can cause them to check out things that are happening, cause them to consider Jesus. When Billy Graham started preaching at the beginning of his career, he was scheduled by the organizing group Christ for Greater Los Angeles to preach for 3 weeks. When word started getting around and people whose lives were being transformed started sharing, he ended up preaching there for 8 weeks. Thousands and thousands of people out of curiosity came to see and to hear. So curiosity can have positive results. Not always positive, because there were those in the crowd that day, they were calling for Jesus to die a few days later, but many, many believed. I am excited. I'm praying that there are going to be many, many people who will be curious enough when they start hearing about Celebrate Minnesota, that they're going to show up to check it out. You hear about this? What do you think? Maybe we should go and check it out. Our children's person is trying to find a Ferris wheel to put up, be able to have kids come to the kids' time. That curiosity factor. Finally, a spiritual motivation of the priest was fear. One of the most powerful motivations of all, fear. So the chief priest, we read, made plans to kill Lazarus as well. Good to be friends with Jesus, huh? For on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him. They've been trying to get rid of Jesus for a while. They now put Lazarus' picture up on the wanted poster. We're talking a miracle here. He is a convincing piece of evidence that Jesus is the Messiah. We've got to deal with him too. They're motivated by fear to do the wrong thing. I'm sure, like I have, you've noticed many people can turn their lives into a train wreck because of fear. The fear of being left out, the fear of being alone, the fear of not being wanted. You get the idea. People do all kinds of things that make no sense at all because the only thing that makes sense is doing whatever they can to try to deal with this feeling of fear for the moment. The Pharisees actually thought they were doing what God wanted. They are convinced that they are motivated to serve God, and fear messed with their logic so much that they ended up having Jesus executed. Wrong motivation always ends up in wrong action. It may not have been immediately apparent, but eventually the results end in devastation. And so by way of conclusion, as we prepare to express our love for Jesus just for a few more minutes in worship this morning, the question is, what is motivating you? Or you should ask it, what is motivating me? What spiritual motivation is running my life? Is it worship and expressing my love for Jesus, or is it selfishness? Because those two motivations can wage quite a battle back and forth. Will I worship God and serve him with everything that I have within me? Or will I keep something for myself? Is it going to be God's way or my way? It might be curiosity. Is it curiosity right now that is leading you to investigate more clearly? Or is it just idle curiosity where you're going, oh, that's interesting? Or is it fear? Remember this, perfect love, the perfect love of God, it drives out fear. When we love God, he drives that fear away. And so as we prepare to just express our love to Jesus this morning, may the example of Mary especially motivate you to express your love for Jesus with a sense of abandonment, so that you'll know the freedom of God's joy that will flood your life when you're loving God with everything that is in you. And then as a result, also being ready to love your neighbor as yourself, when that is why you do what you do.